Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Confluential Live. I'm Kyler Cheatham, your host, and I'm very excited. This is our first actual guest we've had on the Confluential Live, and we couldn't think of a better person to feature and in this conversation. Before I introduce Kristy and have Adam say a few opening words about what we do here at the Confluential, I just want to kind of remind everyone of some logistics. So during this conversation, the point is to exchange ideas, right? It's not about what I say, about what Kristy says, what Adam says. It's about what's best for your organization. And that's really our mission here, is to share that type of insights. A big piece of that, right? It comes from you guys. So we invite you to put your questions, your comments, anything, wherever you're joining us from. It all aggregates here and we can see it on the chat. And I'll bring up the live chat in just a few minutes. So to test that feature, just let us know where you're joining us from today, and maybe we'll just get right into it with an icebreaker question. CapEx or OpEx, right? What should oversee the budget for new technology and why? So we'll put that in there. What type of budget should we have? So we'll just go for it. But with that, we do go live every week. Kristy also has her own fintech community that goes live. If you're in the SMB community or you just want to learn more about financial technology, highly recommend following that. It's a great, great thought leadership channel. I personally learn a lot from it. And the reason we brought her on today is because of that finance background. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to the experts to stop talking, right, is we got this topic from what you guys said last week. So the goal, right, is to make this as valuable of a conversation for you as we possibly can. So let us know what you want to hear, and then we'll kind of set it up moving forward. So with that, Kristy, good morning. If you don't mind doing just a quick intro, and then I'll let Adam kind of intro the Confluential.
Yeah. So my name is Kristy Barber. I have been in the accounting and finance world for 10 years and plus some, specifically in that. Start out in the accounting world, realize that there's so much more to it than just crunching numbers and inputting data into QuickBooks. And it's been really fun over the last 10 years just seeing how technology has evolved, specifically in the accounting world, and how automations have come in and all of these things that make it that much better. And I think it's really exciting to see how this industry is changing, even within the last year and a half, with the introduction of AI into it. And I'm really excited to talk more today, as that has affected how, it is expensed compared to what it used to be when you had older technologies.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's so important, and a piece that people often miss because they're so rushed to the hype that it's not set up correctly in the back end. They're like, we'll get to it. And it's like, right. But it's going to cost you 4 times more to redo all of the things that you just did wrong. So in that conversation, Adam, will you give us just a quick intro to the Confluential, what we do here, and how we're seeing this in the marketplace kind of unfold?
Yeah, so my name's Adam Cheatham. I'm the CEO of the Confluential. At the Confluential, we focus on how different strategies, people, process, and technology work streams come together to add value at their intersections, at their confluences. So what we find in the technical space is that a lot of organizations who are looking to improve their IT ecosystems and help those ecosystems thrive a bit more effectively, they are taking on different types of projects. And when we take on different types of technical projects, you have the ones that you can build and the ones that you can buy. And more often than not, the ones that you can build come from one type of budget, and the ones that you can buy more often these days are coming from a different type of budget. Because from a perspective of accounting rules, by which I am no expert, which is why we have Kristy, I know enough to know that if you're building something, you can call it a capital asset, and that can be depreciated, and there's a significant benefit to that depreciation over time. Whereas if you are talking about something that is a subscription, it often is treated as an operational expense rather than a capital expense, and so therefore it cannot be depreciated. It has no actual value to your organization as something that gets built. And this is a conversation that is really confounding a lot of finance folks, which are say, well, I used to be able to capitalize these ERP projects. So we had all of this advantage in being able to say, because it's capital, because we're creating an asset, it becomes more realistic as something that we should approve because we're building an asset for our company. Same way we would build a building or something else. And today it's become more of a, right, but it's not an asset anymore. We have a subscription to something that we don't own. We don't have any rights to change or modify, which is, I think, a key distinction from a SaaS-based software perspective. And can it be treated as a capital expense? So of course, the system integrators and the software vendors will say what they need to say, and a lot of times we'll try to convince people that the answer is what they would prefer it would be, as opposed to what the auditors are actually going to say. I mean, that matters as people are planning for things. So really looking forward to this conversation in general, because it is something that needs to be solved for. It is something that you have to be able to plan for appropriately, because the last thing you want to do is allocate millions of dollars to something that you were planning on paying for one way and finding out from your auditors that that's not the case, and you got the whole mess of accounting problems to figure out. So that's something that we help a lot of folks with.
Yeah.
It's easier to answer that question when it's an IT team that we're helping reorganize to be able to provide more on their systems that already exist, versus the conversation as it pertains to what happens when we buy new SaaS-based software. So
Absolutely. And so from this conversation, just you guys know I always like to define things so that we can, make sure that we're all speaking the same language, because a lot of times that's half the battle, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to tell you what I think a CapEx, being a very non-accounting person, right, versus OpEx is, Kristy, and you tell me like what's right or wrong. So in the simplest term, CapEx is a capital expenditure, right? So long-term asset investments, hardware, buildings, infrastructure. And so if we have a system that we're building, or like a data center, right, that we're building, those would be a CapEx expense, versus an operating expenditure, which is kind of ongoing costs for service and maintenance. So those would be those SaaS subscriptions, managed services, other cloud subscriptions,
electricity.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. I'm trying to keep it technology based, but we do need power, right, to work our computers. And so this shift, as I understand it, IT versus finance versus leadership, changes how we look at things like ROI, depreciation, agility, all of those different pieces. Correct? Or what would you shift in that definition?
No, that's spot on. CapEx is any of those assets. You always narrow it down in the accounting world. It's property, plant, and equipment. You'll hear it PP and E a lot of times. So it's always just thinking exactly what you said. It's the hardware. It's, your data center. It's anything that is a tangible asset that will have value if you went to sell it. And that's the easiest way to think of it. OpEx is something that's kind of the daily. It's, hey, I have a software subscription. I have managed services, like you said, or hey, I bought some cords to plug the computers all together and make them work. Yeah, it's just an OpEx. And those are things that are always expensed 100% in that moment, where, to your point, and Adam's too, capital expenditures is something that's depreciated and amortized over somewhere 3 to 7 years, depending on what it is. If it's a larger, like a building or whatnot, then you can, it's a couple more years on that. But there's a whole bunch of different rules around that CPAs speak to, and whatever works well with your company and your tax strategy.
So what I hear you saying is like my emotional support plants are definitely an operating expense.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Okay. And so what happens if this is set up wrong? Like, why is this conversation important? Not to be like all doomsday around it, but like, what is the issue if we accidentally, do it in an OpEx versus a CapEx? what's the problem in there?
Well, then it's not being reflected properly on your financials. And interesting enough, I had a client like this about a year ago where they had put as a CapEx all of their SaaS software, and you can't do that. And so when it came time for me to kind of look through it, it's like, oh, wait a second, guys, this isn't right. And then they're working with their CPA also. But a lot of times people come in and they don't know what they don't know in smaller companies. And if you've had experience with larger companies, you know, hey, these are the categories that software goes into. And there's been this shift over the last, what you think, probably 5-6 years of no more on-prem solutions. And so now people that are in these departments within these plants or whatnot have to remember, oh, wait a second, we're not doing accounting like we used to when it comes to new infrastructure.
Right, absolutely. And Adam, I read, and again, no experience really in this conversation, but I read that a lot of times this is a huge risk for no exit strategy too, in not appropriating the funds correctly, because you're locked into these multi-service agreements without any sort of like governance or guardrails or anything like that. What would you speak to that like that? And then I'm going to go to the audience to get to some of these great questions.
So from a perspective of exit strategy, I think that thought process, can you sell it, is a key part of the capital side of things, right? And there's an argument to be made that if you have a bespoke system that's highly customized for you, you can't technically sell it. But if you have a code base that you can sell, right? There is something in there that is, I can hand you something that you might pay money for. In these SaaS-based subscriptions, you can't sell that code. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to somebody else. And the contracts are very specific that you can neither modify nor do anything with this. And none of this work is transferable. All of the enhancements that are made to this don't belong to you. They belong to the vendor. And it is very specific to those types of things. So as you start to think about exit strategy, your only exit strategy from a SaaS-based software is a different software. Now that doesn't mean that you can't move from a SaaS-based software to an on-prem software, but those are difficult to find these days. So I'm just that for me is the key part of it, is that regardless of the argument on can you sell an on-prem system that's been highly customized, you have a bit more firm ground to stand on, because you do have code that you can sell, and code is something that people will pay for. But you can't do that with a SaaS-based environment, because it doesn't belong to you. I have a million questions that I'm curious about Kristy's opinion on this, but that I want to ask. But I am curious about something. I suspect that when the idea of building software first came up, that this was a similar conversation, which was, it's software. You can't sell software. Like it's, but people found a way to make an argument that it's capitalizable. And today that's the norm, right? But I'm just thinking about in like the 80s and 90s when somebody says, we're going to buy this software system. They said, how are we going to make this capital or OpEx? Because that's a conversation that's been happening in accounting since accounting was invented. Do you think that conversation was as difficult then as it is now? And do you think that there will be ways of finding an excuse to capitalize these SaaS-based systems, or do you think there's still a hard line on that?
That's a good one. I think it's tricky because businesses are always looking at ways, how can we slowly write things off or quickly write things off. And that's the hard part with CapEx these days, because OpEx, because you're 100% writing off all of those software costs. And then it makes your company not look that great that year when you may have made a large purchase. You're like, gosh, it was one of our best years selling, but then you get down to the net profit because we bought a new software and it looks like we're doing terrible. Where when you're on the CapEx side, we're slowly writing it off over 3-7 years, whatnot, and then it makes your P&L look a little bit healthier. And I think in the 80s and 90s, you were able to do that. There was, things were just a lot different. And you look at all of the accounting rules that are out there now, and it's, hey, this is what they were. And I don't think anything has really changed since the 80s and 90s when you look at those key, the GAAP rules and the FASB rules of what's out there. And so I'm curious to see if maybe the accounting industry will start to change things now that we're moving to mostly all subscription-based software. It's very rare now that you have on-prem unless you're in very specific industries. Like we've worked with like the aerospace and things like that, where SaaS isn't totally an option. But even still, as you're moving to those government clouds and whatnot, how will they take care of this in the future so that the financials will look a little bit healthier in that respect? So I'm curious to see how that will pan out now that everybody's moving to this type of structure.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thought process because the world evolves, right? And that's part of what business is all about. I'm curious how this conversation will change because there are certainly enough folks who want it to be
yes. I think every conversation when you're in the room with the vendor and the client, they're like, so how are we going to do this? Can we capitalize it? And I think the poor vendors sometimes, like, they know, they're like, well, but it's like, we want the sale, but we don't want to tell you the hard truth sometimes. Yeah. And here it is.
Well, you should ask your auditor that question. Is who you should ask, I think, because they're going to be the ones that say you made the wrong decision or not. So why not just figure it out from them at that point in time? So
yeah,
probably because no one wants to talk to auditors, so
probably not, and they don't want to talk to you either. Yeah. But
they don't want to talk to
you. Really, really important to have, and something all small businesses should have their books audited, once a year, just to make sure nothing got missed by their internal team or by a CPA. It's highly recommended.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, it sounds like a scary word, but we kind of have to disarm that. Like language matters to a point, but you can't be scared of a word, especially if you don't understand what that means. And so let's look at some of these questions here on the side. The overlay is not showing up, so I'm just going to pull them up. Oh, here we go. Never mind. We popped. So we've got lots of questions, really great questions in here. I'll go ahead and ask some of them. If you, Kristy or Adam, see one, you're like, I want to answer that, just jump in and let me know and I'll pull it up here on the screen. But I think a lot of these are talking about kind of the financial technology decisions, right? And that's been this colliding of two worlds, like we've seen in other areas of business where technology has become more of the backbone. That's, the different takes we had last week on where should technology decision making lie, right? Adam says with the business, I say with the IT team, and everybody's kind of on different terms. Really, it matters what your organization is doing, right?
Well, Kristy says we're finance and we're the ones going to approve it. So.
I know, right? So but I will say from experience, and I know you can speak to this, Adam, too, you always know when a certain department is driving like a technology direction because of how decisions are being made. And you're like, oh, yeah, this IT driven, you can kind of see how that shows up. Or if accounting, they're really honing in on certain things, and parts of the rest of the business that will utilize the software the most get forgotten.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, the end user is like, who? You know? And then you're like, okay, well, you built this entire or bought this entire software for people that don't actually do that, right? In the organization, you just thought they did, right? And that's a huge issue, which brings me to this question, which I think is a really good kind of baseline question. And it could go for any department, right? How do you get finance and IT speaking the same language around these different, whether it's investment priorities, whether it's technical priorities? This can be kind of a meeting of two different agendas, right? And kind of remembering everyone's marching to the same goal, but everybody has different responsibilities and priorities in that conversation. So I'll let you take this first, Kristy, and then Adam, you can add any color to it you want.
So I think with this one, I think it's hard sometimes because finance has their own language and they assume that everybody knows their language and they just kind of drop some words here and there. And in the same way with IT, they kind of come in and I've seen that they think similar enough where it's this very linear type thinking and a lot of times, but then as Adam can attest to this, as work we've done together, the accountants, we get too much in the weeds and it's like, hey, we need to get pulled back out and kind of look at things. And I think IT can do that as well. And so it's just coming together and kind of defining, what does investment look like? What are those risks? How are we going to expose those, or how are we getting to our ROI? And being able, especially with ROI, I think, how can we both get to the conclusion of what we need is best and not chase shiny objects, kind of see what the value is in doing that, and then seeing how are those going to tie together with the overall outcome. So we're going to have a roadmap for whatever this technology endeavor looks like, and how can where IT wants to go kind of get in alignment with finance.
I think part of this question splits two different things apart. One of them is requirements based, right? Getting finance and IT to speak the same language about requirements is one thing, right? I need this, you need that. And in that scenario, finance is the business, right? So, and IT is responsible for helping them meet those requirements through some type of a technical environment. So getting them to speak the same language creates a scenario where IT needs to look to understand what it is the business is trying to convey, and finance needs to look to understand what it is IT is trying to help them with, right? So the seeking to understand conversation in that spot, I think, is key from a requirements perspective. From a strategic funding perspective and how we do this or that, are we going to buy this or not? Honestly, I don't think this is a finance or an IT conversation. I think it's a chief executive officer type of answer, which is finance's job is to figure out how to pay for it. IT's job is to figure out how to do it. And in getting them to speak the same language, you dial it up a level in the hierarchy to say, where is this strategic imperative coming from? And that becomes a conversation of, we have somebody who says this is the area that we need to go down, and so we need to figure out how to do that. Finance can certainly often say no, right, because we can't afford that, it's not going to provide the right return on investment and this, that, or the other, and they are a representative of the business. So I think that there's an appropriate leveraging authority in that space. But for me, as it comes to funding, returns, and those types of things, that's a more of a C-suite type of a conversation as opposed to a departmental discussion. And that's how I would get them speaking the same language, is pull it out of both of their hands and put it in a leadership group's hands and say, what do we want to do with our money, right? Do we want to put aside whether or not it's CapEx or OpEx, do we want to do this? It costs money. And are we going to get the purpose out of it? Can we pull it off? And that's the conversation that you should be having. And then at that point, when somebody says, yes, figure it out, finance and IT then have a similar type of conversation, which is IT says, this is what we're capable of doing with these resources. And finance says the same thing. This is what we're capable of doing with these resources. The difference is IT's resources are people and time, and finance's resources are money, right? Spend this amount on this or that, and it, based on our analysis, it will provide this type of a return or that. And then an executive says, go do it, and then finance figures it out, right? Does it have to be capital? Does it have to be operational? Part of the deal.
Yeah, and I think, let's dig into that CFO, CIO, CDO, CTO. You guys are always like, there's no CIO anymore. Well, there is a lot of CIOs, right? So that dynamic is often a very challenging one. Sometimes we see projects that are run under the CFO's office, right? Because that's who's, really looking at it from a cost perspective. Sometimes, right, we see more of that CIO, CFO partnership. Talk about the importance of that collaboration, Kristy, if you will.
Yeah, and I think I've seen this a lot too, and I know there's different ones where the CFO has a different I think it's hard, and kind of going back to what you just said, Adam, it really has to come from the top down. And I think it's hard when it is driven by one or the other, and maybe the CEO isn't as involved as you would want to be. And so you don't have the overall vision of what should be in there. And it's kind of getting more personalized. I can think of that from things that I've seen, and I know you've seen as well, as, hey, I have a CFO driving this, and just their intentions around it are very different because it's looking at things from a cost perspective a lot of times versus maybe what's really needed. And I think CFOs, the accounting department, our favorite word is no. We don't have money to do this. And there probably is money to do this. It's just being creative with that, or not holding the purse strings so tight, versus CIOs are like, hey, this is fantastic. This is exactly what we need. And it's $5 million, and we should probably go run after and get this. So I think it's just interesting, the dynamics that come into play with the different personalities behind those departments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always definitely a challenge, but definitely something that we can all agree should be made at the executive level.
Yeah.
And that's something that can often be a challenge because a lot of times we have, the IT team or the end user groups that know that we need this sort of technology. It's about getting to all those different steps. Like a lot of times we're helping our clients make business cases for those types of different conversations with their CIO, their CEO, their CFO, whatever, right? With just the C-suite in general. And that can be difficult for a project team that's never done that before,
Yeah.
right? Because then we run into these roadblock barriers. So let's get back to some of these other questions. Do you two either see one that you like, or I can just keep plucking them up here?
Disappeared
I
on
like this.
my
How do
side.
you handle when finance and IT are operating on completely different timelines and priorities? That's always right. So this is kind of part of the balance in the relationship, and some of this is going to depend on your company structure, right? Kristy and I work together on a lot of small organizations that are fairly flat. We've worked together on larger organizations that have a different type of structure. Does your IT team report to finance? Right,
Yeah.
that creates a particular way of saying, how do I handle it when they have to? Well, you do what IT says if they are on level footing and they have a good case for it and that fits with the strategy. But if IT reports to finance, the answer is clear, right? You do what finance says because they're top in the priority in the hierarchy. So when we're thinking about these things on different timelines and priorities, you have to start to pull things apart from a perspective of how you're set up as a company. And if you have this scenario where there are two more equal-footed or at least separate departments, and clean and clearly separate, where they don't report to one another, you have to have a conversation that's a bit more wide-ranging, as both of these functions are services to the business operations, right? Neither of them are technically operational. Neither of them make their own money in most cases, right? Finance can make its own money, you can make investments, those types of things. But for me, that's where this starts to get into the conversation of how do you balance those and say operations needs this, sales needs this. When we're talking about driving revenue and profits, where do these timelines and priorities align mostly with that core business function, which is revenue and profits? And that's how I would break that out. It does tend to lean in an advantage for finance because they tend to talk more in revenue and profit than IT does, just more naturally. But I'm curious what you've run into with this type of question, Kristy.
I think a lot of times they are always running on slightly different priorities just because of the differences in the departments, where finance is looking priority more so, hey, cost wise, and IT is, looking more, hey, how can this solve some problems that we're experiencing on a day to day? So I think it gets interesting on that respect. But when they're operating on completely different timelines, I think that's when it gets tricky. And I've seen that where you have people come in and they have very unrealistic expectations of, well, we should be able to get this done in 3 months, and we'll work all day, all night to get it done. And it's like, well, no, that's not completely it. Or even the timeline being, we want to implement it tomorrow, start this thing, and finance comes in and is like, well, we don't have budget to do that yet. We need to wait. And I think that's something like we always say, that when you're starting down the road of looking at larger pieces of software, do you have a budget in place for this? Have you been saving or putting money aside, or do you know how you can put funds to this so that potentially you may not have such a different timeline of when the business needs it versus when there's money that can be allotted to it?
Absolutely. So how many transformations, right, do you think has died on the hill of budget structure?
I think there's ones that I don't know. I don't think I haven't seen very many, other than the fact of, hey, remember these extra things you wanted? We don't have it in the budget to do that. That's going to be a phase 2. And so you kind of go in with this, oh, this is awesome, I want all of this. And by the time you get to, signing papers, you've maybe divided it into 3 phases because of costing. So I see that as still, it didn't necessarily fail. We're just pushing things off until it makes more sense to utilize those dollars, and also being able to know the software and use it. And do you really need these added things in there?
Yeah, for sure. Which I think is this one's a good one for you, Adam. And then of course, Kristy, definitely let us know your thoughts. What's the biggest financial mistake you see organizations make when funding a technology project? And the way I want to, I'll get to it. The way I want to approach this question is from an organization size standpoint. Adam is an expert in larger, $1 billion+ organizations. Kristy is an expert in kind of creating these foundational fundamentals when it comes to SMBs, family-owned businesses. And I'll remind you that the SMB community is still 500 million and below, right? That's a big-ish business. But I think we'll take it from those 2 different sides so our audience can kind of get those 2 different perspectives. So Adam, what do you think?
I'm curious to see if our answers are different. But what I think the biggest financial mistake people make when they're funding these types of technology projects is not planning for it to cost more than they're told it's going to cost.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It is whatever number you're given today at the starting point, add at least 10% to it, at least, and put that aside. Assume that that's going to happen. And that's the biggest mistake that organizations make in this. The second biggest mistake that they make in this is they don't plan for all of the costs of it, right? And that's the other piece of it, where from a large organization perspective, we're talking about multiple sites, we're talking about a significant amount of internal resources, multiple teams, and this large phased approach where we need to figure out, like if we got 70 sites, we might not go live at all of them at the same time. So when we start thinking about things that are additional costs, how about the people that are on your team that are going to be necessary for this? There's a cost for that. And in larger organizations, many times they need to start, their salaries or their contractor rates or whatever need to start being allocated to a different GL bucket, because it goes to the project, not to their existing department, and they get moved onto this. And that's a cost that doesn't come with the order form, right? Travel costs at multiple sites, right? You have to go to all of them. I don't care what anybody says. You got to go to all of them at least once. Somebody needs to be there. Or if you can take somebody from that site and bring them to corporate, but that's still travel, right? Your consultants are going to travel. Not accounting for travel fees is a major bucket that can add up really quickly. And then the last bucket that gets underestimated is the integrations and customizations bucket. It has to tie to something you're not. I promise you, no matter what it is you think you're going to do, you're not going to stand up one single system with zero integrations and zero customizations. They may not happen in the existing system because they don't call them customizations in SaaS software anymore, but you are going to write custom code somewhere, at the very least integrate with something. And those are all buckets that people just, well, I see a price tag, I have a professional services fee, that's what it's going to cost. And they leave all of these other costs out. And what you should do is you should figure out every teeny tiny penny that's going to go into this. I don't care if you need more whiteboard markers for this project, right? You might set up a war room. I had a client one time that bought a house so that they could set it aside as the project location where they were going to co-locate all of the project team members in this building so that they could all work together. That's a cost of that project, right? So getting all these costs together and then add your contingency to that. That's the biggest financial mistake people make. And OpEx, CapEx has more to do with what it looks like on the books.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A dollar is coming from somewhere. But that's my opinion. Kristy, What about you?
No, I would totally agree with you. And I think the one thing I would add is just the cost of not doing anything when you've had to pause because your team is so small and they can't keep up with the daily and the implementation gets pushed out, or certain things haven't been done ahead of time, like data cleansing or whatnot, that takes a lot of time. And then you weren't prepared when the implementation started. And so now things get pushed out. So I've seen those come into place. And I think the biggest thing is if there's a pivot during the middle of the implementation and you're like, oh, we went down this route and this doesn't work for us. We actually need this over here, and not budgeting for maybe an additional module that you thought you were fine with the regular, and now you got to go to an advanced module for it, and you didn't put money aside for that either.
Yeah. That's a great one.
Contingency is the biggest thing. People always forget to put, like you said, 15% aside for that, because you will use it.
Yeah. It will go, the plan for it.
Yeah.
That's why it's there. And if you've got, this is going to sound like nails on a chalkboard to people, but if you can plan for 20% and control it, because there's kind of this conversation was, well, if I plan for 10%, I'm going to spend, it's going to get spent. So if I plan for 20%, and that's going to get spent too. Well, that depends on you, buddy.
Yeah.
You're going to spend
problem.
some. Whether or not you decide you need to spend all of it is up to you. And there's kind of the interdepartmental of, well, if we get approved for it, we don't spend it. The next time we won't get as much. Well, are you going to implement another ERP next time? Like most people seek to implement one ERP for the company that they're working for and never want to do it again. Right. So let's not plan for having to ask for another ERP budget next time and had to battle that, well, you didn't spend all of your money. And so that's actually not a bad thing. But anyway.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about AI in this conversation, right? So AI has obviously become a massive strategy when it comes to overall technology stack. However, what?
I said hope is a massive strategy too.
Hopes and dreams. Absolutely. And so what I want to know from you guys is this idea, right? Where does it sit on the balance sheet, right? Because people have quite literally come out and been like, hey, for 2026, we're an AI first company. And so I assume that now they're like, okay, is that a CapEx? But it's also a subscription fee, right? Unless you're building your own platform, which is likely also a subscription fee, right? Because where is the platform hosting? Is it on AWS? Is it on Azure? Where is it, right? Type of thing. So I'm curious to see what your approach to be with this, Kristy.
My understanding is if you're using another tool to build it, then yes, that would be kind of that subscription model. But some people are doing their own code, and now that becomes your intellectual property, and you can keep that on your balance sheet. That becomes, a depreciable asset on that side. And so I think that's what's kind of exciting, is that part moves in, is as people are developing all of these things, they can kind of tap into some of those older, the 80s and 90s rules because it's the IP side of it. Yeah, you don't own the overall software, but you've built something that is of value and you can sell that. And I think that's the thing to always keep in mind. If it's something that has value and you can sell it and get money for it, then probably it's going to be a capital expenditure.
Yeah, I love this question and I love that answer because I think that AI is something that you should build for yourself.
Yeah.
You should build this in, and this is something that we help companies do this.
Yeah.
And our approach to it is, look, we'll show you how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But then they say, well, I can't just give you our models and our data. Like that belongs to us. Well, honestly, I don't want it. I've had to read through all of those data contracts, what you had to do as a business to be compliant with all of our data protocols, so that we can actually give you our data and how it is you're going to have to secure it. And this, I don't want that. No way. You think I want to be responsible for your data as a large utility, aerospace and defense, natural gas, whatever company? And no, I don't want that responsibility. That should be yours, and you should protect it, right? So let's show you how to build an agent within your organization. Then you wrote it, you built it. We can help consult on how it is you should accomplish that. A lot of the tactics are very similar. What are your requirements? What do you want this thing to do? And what do you want it not to do? What's our scope? How are we going to do this? And then we build it. And then you have people that do that. You have people that maintain it, and it becomes owned by you. And those software platforms are no different than the development environments that you're using to support your AS400 ERP, right? You own those things. Just because you write it on a software platform like N8N or whatever doesn't mean N8N owns that. You do. You built it. And now we have a capital investment, yeah? And now we can start thinking about it that way. And if it bombs, it's still a capital investment, right? It's as opposed to an operational expense. And there are some advantages and disadvantages, right? Because carrying a loss versus picking when you're going to do it is a different conversation. But I really very much agree with Kristy on that. If you're gonna go AI agents and you build them yourself, that's a capital expenditure, and that's a different type of approach. And we actually tell a lot of clients, you should build your own, and you should be responsible for it, because you don't want these agents to be something that somebody else owns and can take away or screw up because they're managing them poorly. You want to be responsible for that. So
yeah, one of the funniest conversations we've ever had is when a Fortune 50 company called us, and we're like, why are you calling us? Like, you got every single vendor on speed dial. They would talk to you immediately. And he was like, well, I want to build this and I want to know if they can actually do it. And Adam goes, oh yeah, they can do it for sure, but they'll sell it to your competitor in 5 days.
You don't own that. You don't own it.
Exactly. So, and he was like so shocked. It was one of my favorite conversations, because it's like, no doubt about it, people can do that for you. It's about what you're going to do with that next level of having your own technology strategy and their own proprietary piece. So my last question is kind of,
one thing I want to add to that real quick though is you do see that in kind of hidden print when you do sign your contracts about any intellectual property that has been made. You do not own it. You just will have access to it. And so I had a client about 5 years ago. They were working with an ERP that didn't have certain technology. And the vendor was, hey, we'll go in 50%, you go in 50%, you get lifetime access to it, but you don't own it. And there's those little things that are hidden in there that you want to make sure, hey, do you want to go down that route or not?
Absolutely. And I think we say this in probably every episode, as we should, right? There is no other contract in business except for organized crime, right? That actually tries to steal your money in that way. And whether it's nefarious or not, I like the drama, right? Adam likes to be more logical about that type of stuff. You just need to review it, right? You absolutely need to know every sentence. And it's not an internal counsel thing, right? You've never seen a contract like this. You need someone that specializes in that type of thing. So I especially I would assume for SMBs, right? Because they don't have any idea, right? Not because they're not brilliant and smart. It's just the internal capabilities that they, sign their system away. And we have this billion-dollar machine that's trying to constantly sell them software that's, claiming to get their business to the next level. Will it get their business to the next level? Maybe. But then what happens when you don't own that secret sauce that got you to the next level, right? So it's very, very interesting, which brings me to kind of this conversation around money and SaaS and building, right? So we've seen the evolution of the industry go from these bigger monolithic systems, right, that they implement, really outsource, whether it's to managed service provider, vendor, SI, whatever, right? And now we're starting to see businesses be like, you know what, I can't use ERP. Like, I'm too specialized for that type of, bigger standardization in software. Or we've seen big software literally block their data if they're trying to integrate with any of these different AI platforms. And then so we see this movement into kind of building their own, even if it's crafted with like best of breed solutions and things like that. I'm wondering if you see SaaS actually save any of these businesses real money, because that's what the claim is, right? Is this infrastructure is going to be revolutionizing your welcome customer, right? That we give you this platform. Does that actually save businesses money in any way, shape, or form? Kristy, go.
I was just going to tell Adam, we've had these conversations before when we've done like the ROI analysis of here's how quickly your investment will pay for itself when you go down the on-prem side versus SaaS side, and kind of looking at that way. So I was like, you should speak, because we've had so many conversations about that.
Well, it's part of it is how much are you spending right now, right? You have a software environment today, more than likely. How much is it costing you, right? Like I have a client right now, they're paying $500,000 in licenses and maintenance on an old system, and it is costing them a significant amount of money to maintain that environment. And so the question becomes, okay, so if I'm going to move to a SaaS-based environment, what are my expenses going to be on that, and how quickly can I get off the old system? And there's a part of the math in that space that's important, right? Will it save you money? And that's just a matter of if I change cell phone plans, will it save me money? What's the return of an investment on changing a cell phone plan? Well, it's not a change in return on investment. It's a reduction in cost, hopefully. And then when you start thinking about it that way, it becomes if my increase is going to be X amount of dollars, how much more am I going to be enabled by? And you can make arguments on returns on investments for ERPs and stuff like that. They usually are pretty thin. For example, and it's funny, I had this conversation with folks, and they're always, some of them are very shocked by this approach to it, but you had this conversation. I'm going to buy this ERP, and it's going to save me X amount of hours, which means it's going to save me X amount of dollars times X amount of hours, which is this is going to save me all this money. It's like, okay, so who's getting fired?
Yeah.
Well, we're not cutting headcount. It's like, well, then it's going to save you $0. Like all of those hours that you just calculated, $100 an hour, $50, $10, whatever it is, at times X number of hours. If you are still going to maintain the same company headcount, you are saving $0, because it's not going. You're still paying it, right? Now, this is why it starts to get thin, because now my argument has to become, okay, so you're freeing up this person's 10 hours of this person's time, 10 hours of that person's time. What are they going to do instead? Well, they're going to add more value, right? Let's talk about the easiest connection. When I say I'm going to free up my salespeople's time, I'm going to give them 10 more hours apiece. And we'll use simple math. I got 8 salespeople. I'm going to free up 10 hours each of them. I'm going to free up 80 hours a week. I basically am freeing up 2 full-time employees. And so I'm going to save that money. No, you're not, because you're not firing any of your salespeople, which is fine. I'm not arguing that you should. But the question then becomes, what are they all going to do with that? And then the assumption becomes, well, they're going to make more sales. Okay, cool. That sales aren't guaranteed, though. What happens if they make the same exact number of sales? Then you did nothing, right? So your assumption that they're going to change, make more sales, X number, it's going to increase by X percent, and then that's going to increase at this level of revenue. Okay, what if they make more sales, but it has no impact on their actual deal size, right? Now we're not necessarily getting anywhere. So our argument on return starts to get thin. You could also make the argument, well, we're going to be able to identify, we're going to produce more at less cost. Okay. On which machines? Are we buying new ones? No, I thought we were talking software here, right? So our output's going to go up. Well, you can say that we're now able to handle more output, but you still have to make other investments in this. So the argument on return on investment, and Kristy, I'm curious if what you've seen in these spaces as well. But for me, the argument on ROI on software gets thin really quickly.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think there's always that buzzword that floats around in the office to make people feel safe is, oh, we're taking away your tactical work and we're giving you strategic work to do. And you're like, cool, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's you're adding more value or whatnot, but there's really no plan to tell them how it's going to be done. It's just, you're not manually entering something in anymore. And to your point too, most times they're not letting any staff go. It's keeping exactly the same number of employees. And then sometimes it's hiring additional people as well, because they're like, well, we need somebody to manage the software from a different way, because you have admins for the cloud that's different than you would for the on-prem type management. And they're like, well, we got to hire somebody for that. And then now you're 5 new hires in, and it really didn't save you money. Maybe you're just more efficient with your time and your invoices look prettier when they print out.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's the part that gets tricky is I think everybody wants to say, oh, this new solution is going to save me X dollars, but they can't really put a number to it because it's arbitrary in so many ways.
Yeah. There is a question on here that I'm curious your thought process on. We should pick this apart. Yes. How did you know?
One mind.
She's like, I got this.
Weird, but no. So why we're moving from an ERP to a cloud infrastructure via CapEx?
I have heard, and again, don't quote me on this, but I have heard when it's a one-time migration type, because technically it's tied to like some type of new asset, then it could be. But I know it's kind of really gray area to operate in, and that's one of those. Double and triple check with your CPA, because I would hate for you to get audited and then you owe money and all of these things. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that this one for me, part of the question becomes: Are you moving your on-prem ERP to a virtual environment, and you're just moving it? Like we're not changing ERPs, we're just moving it into a cloud, which is, people start to think, well, if I'm going to be in the cloud, right? So I got to go to the SaaS space. Actually, technically, you don't. You can move your on-prem software into the cloud. The only difference is that it's still on-prem somewhere, right? It's still on a virtual server that exists somewhere. There is still hardware involved in this. So I think that's a key distinction. If we're just moving our existing software into an environment, that's no different than if you have multiple sites. The people that live on the other side of the world that log into your on-prem system here are now it's the same thing to them, right? It's for them. It's in the cloud, right? It's on the internet. It's in the cloud. It's hosted somewhere. So from that perspective, if we're just migrating our existing system from our closet or whatever, our own little data center to a different one, I would say that that's far more clearly CapEx because you still maintain that existing
You
environment.
do.
It still belongs to you. It's still something you built.
You
If
would
we're
just not be able to capitalize it, because then it's kind of like whatever that data center is that's hosting it for you. Like if you're moving it to AWS or something like that, then that becomes an OpEx. But you're still, like, to your point, it hasn't changed anything. So it's continually being that asset that's just hosted somewhere different.
So you're you just end up splitting it a little bit, but not quite as badly as if I'm moving from an on-prem ERP to a SaaS-based ERP. That's clearly leans more towards the OpEx category. The one thing that's starting to go away these days is you can buy a software system that's not multi-tenant SaaS and host it somewhere else, host it in the cloud, and then that way the build of it can become more arguably CapEx coming from the guy that's not the accountant. To be fair, versus is more clearly OpEx if it's SaaS based. So there's a little bit of that conversation. If you're buying software, know what you're buying, right? So if I'm buying licenses to a software that's just hosted in the cloud, that is a different thing than I am buying a SaaS-based license that is also, to be fair, hosted in the cloud, but it's the subscription model.
Yeah. And definitely, I would say, Darwin, if you want to message me like your specific scenario, I can grab that insight from Kristy and Adam, because it really is going to depend on a lot of different things. But this is such a good question. I know, Kristy, we have to get you back to your work day here, but we've so appreciated your insight. I didn't even get to ask you about the Deloitte fraud in Australia, which I'm just dying to know your opinion on at some point.
At some point.
But we will cover that if you want to talk about that. I will be live on TikTok in about 15 minutes once I make sure that my children are still alive. And we'll kind of go through what happened in that. So I invite you to come on over. We are live every week. Kristy goes live earlier in the week too, to talk about all things kind of finance, S&B. Highly recommend you give her a follow to be able to kind of talk through that. I know she had to jump to another call because we just can't get enough of her insight over here. So thank you so much, the audience, for joining us. I'll go back in there and answer those questions. And then we can keep this conversation going. Adam and I will see you next week. If you have something you'd like us to talk about, feel free to drop it in the comments or message us. So thanks so much, my friends, and we'll catch